Hello and welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 9, Today in Dana. Well, hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for taking 20 or so minutes out of your very busy day, I'm sure, to let me fill your ears with some great podcast recommendations. Before I begin this week, as I've been doing here a lot lately, it's been very humbling to see the response to the Podcast Digest over these last couple of weeks, especially the last week. It has been phenomenal, and I want to thank you right now, whoever's ears I'm in right now, on your ear pods, on your Bluetooth speaker, in your vehicle, to thank you for joining me. It is really you that has made this whole thing possible. It has given me the motivation and inspiration to keep coming back to this microphone, to keep putting together these show notes, to keep listening to all these new shows, to find out the best ones that I want to tell all of you about. So thank you very much for listening to the Podcast Digest. So let's get right into this week's episode. I'm really excited about the subject matter I've got for you on my first section, as well as the two show recommendations. So let's begin, shall we, with my listener pro tip section. This week, I want to talk about a subject that's come up recently in my own subscription list, and that is talking about show length. Now, if you are new to podcast listening, and I know some of you are, but if you're also a veteran, if you've sort of been like me, where for years and years this has been a great source of entertainment for you, you may have some strong feelings when you come across a new show, or maybe even something in your regular subscription list, and you see an out of ordinary or an astronomical episode length with a particular show. It may not necessarily be something you want to see. It may have an element of commitment to it, or, wow, this is going to take a while. And I can understand that. I've had those same feelings. You have certain shows maybe that you enjoy, but you're not extraordinarily passionate about, and when you see something come across as 2.5 hours or 3+ hours, you're like, oh, wow, is this really going to be worth it? I've had some thoughts on this recently, and I'll tell you why at the end of this segment. But a couple quick notes. Here's my thoughts on what I think, Dan Lizette from the Podcast Digest, about show length. First of all, there is a place for the shorter show, and I think there is some value that comes with the kind of quick in and out. Sort of like this show, the Podcast Digest. I try to keep things to about 20 minutes or so, not because I think there's anything particularly special about that show length, or that I want to put an extra emphasis on your time. I mean, quite frankly, if I had the opportunity to go longer, I might, and we'll talk about at the end of this week's episode some ideas I have for the future of the Podcast Digest. But there's also some other great short form podcasts out there, the 10-minute podcasts, the quick minute type podcasts, some of the NPR daily news type things, the quick in and outs, give you the quick update, the quick information, quick entertainment, and there's definitely value in that as well. And I hope you're finding value in this show, by the way. But the fact of the matter is that if you really enjoy something, I'm of the mindset that the length of the episode or episodes really doesn't matter. And let me tell you why I think that. Because value and entertainment is sort of agnostic to length. And what I mean by that is that, think about movies you've watched. I bet you've seen 80-minute movies in the theater that you've thoroughly enjoyed. But I bet you could also point to a 2-hour and 45-minute movie that you've also enjoyed. Same with books. You've read the 140-page Kindle book, or the 575-page, Lord of the Rings style type book as well, and probably thoroughly enjoyed both of them. So when you think about movies and books, there are various lengths that I'm going to bet that you've enjoyed in the past. And I don't think podcasts are really all that much different. I think they can be varying lengths. I think there can be enjoyment on both ends of the spectrum. But here's one suggestion I'd like to make. Don't let any single episode of a podcast turn you off, especially because of length. Many shows may not plan on running as long as they end up doing so, but the content is so good that they've decided to bring it all to you. And when you see a particular show that maybe you've been a fan of for a while go long in a given week, don't take it as negative, but rather look at it as, wow, there must be a lot of good stuff in here if this show I really like has decided to provide me with this much content. There's there's got to be something good in here, and go in with that kind of open mind. Also, from a listening standpoint, I would say it's okay to break it up. Take a pause, maybe change shows, come back later. Maybe if you've got a longer episode from a show you've typically enjoyed, maybe you can listen to it just on your drive into work every week, or your commute home, or maybe while you're cooking dinner or doing the dishes every night. Just kind of take it in bits and pieces and sort of break that up. It's a unique approach because, say, like the Podcast Digest, if it's a weekly show, those bits and pieces may be able to keep you going throughout the 7 days until a new episode comes in, and that's kind of nice to sort of have what feels like a steady stream of new content coming at you. And here's one more idea, and I think this is extraordinarily important, and in fact, to me is the most important. Give the hosts feedback. Seriously, if you really like the longer show, let them know. Let them know that the time, effort, and energy in post-production or just in recording themselves was worth it to you. Let them know that you enjoyed this longer form content. Or, conversely, maybe you didn't. Maybe you thought it dragged on. Maybe you thought, it may have been better in a little more condensed version. Or, I enjoyed this week's show, but not as much as some of your previous shows that were a little bit shorter. Shoot them an email. Find them on Twitter. I can tell you from myself, hosts love feedback. They like to know when we all put our voices out here through this microphone that there's somebody on the other end, that our voice are hitting the ears of somebody who likes to consume what we're putting out. So if you like the length, don't like the length, let them know. And really that is the best way that you can sort of let your opinions know on show length. But don't let that detract you from listening or unsubscribing or not giving a show a chance. If you've just come across it and you look at an episode and you're like, wow, that's too long, let them know that, you are a listener who enjoys their show, but maybe would like things a little bit shorter. So why do I bring this up? Well, one of my favorite podcasts, I reviewed them back on episode 5, Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks, did a monstrosity of an episode. It was over 4 hours. It was featuring a guest, Grant from 7 Days a Geek, and I listened to it all of it, in one day. And let me tell you, it was awesome. Why? Because I'm a fan of their show. I'm a fan of their work. I'm a fan of the conversations that they have on that episode. And I let them know. I let them know a couple times throughout my listening experience, if you will. Feedback that I had on the show, some lines I liked, a small technical issue I found, and just let them know that I was enjoying what they did, because I'm envisioning myself in front of this microphone for a period of time of over 4 hours. And, and these are individuals who've really put out significant effort and commitment and blocked off a huge part of one evening to provide content to me, one of their subscribers. And that's the way I took it, that this was coming towards me. And it's sort of the way I hope that you listening to me right now think about this episode coming towards you. So anyways, go back and listen to my episode 5 if Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks and a potential 4-hour episode is something that's appealing to you. I promise you will enjoy episode 5 as well as Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks. It is just a absolute blast of a podcast. Check them out. Speaking of great podcasts, let's get into this week's show recommendations. Again, I kind of want to preface this just one more time, and because, and I know I've said this before, when I switched my release schedule to midweek, I was doing Sundays early on, is because of one of my other jobs as a mobile DJ has gotten very, very busy for me. Right now I'm in the middle of a string of weddings. So again, this week I'm going to go back to a couple of old stalwarts, if you will, things I've been listening to for a long, long time. But that doesn't make these recommendations to me any more valid, or any less valid, I should say, in my enthusiasm on you checking these shows out. But I just want to be sure that this isn't something that, from some obscure dark corner that you're hoping I'll bring to you this week. Those show recommendations are coming, I promise you. As we get more into the winter months, I'm going to be finding a lot of lesser known shows that I think are great that I want to be able to tell you about. So just to put that little caveat again before we begin. But my first show recommendation this week is Today in iOS. The host, Rob Walsh, one of the podfathers, if you will. If you know anything about podcasting, if you're a podcaster yourself, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you've probably heard of Rob Walsh. He is employed by Libsyn, one of the podcast hosting service that I know many podcasters use, including yours truly. My feed is hosted by Libsyn, and I'm very pleased with their service. But Rob's podcast, and one of his biggest, most current ones, is Today in iOS. Rob can be found on Twitter at Podcast411, which was actually one of his original podcasts, and you can check out this website for the show at tii.libsyn.com. This podcast, of course, is about iOS and all things Apple. It's been around since April 2007, and if you are a iOS or mobile technology nerd, yes, that date is before the original iPhone was launched, and it's one of the largest iPhone-centric podcasts around, maybe the largest. Rob has put out weekly releases, and it includes well over 300 episodes all the way back to April 2007. It is one of the preeminent and authoritative iOS-based shows out there. Rob, as I mentioned, is one of the podcast professionals. I referenced him in an early episode when I talked about launching this show. Rob has a free iBook, Podcast 101. It's in the iBook store on an Apple device, specifically an iPad, and that has basically been my playbook or my blueprint to launch this show. For the first 3 or 4 episodes, I literally was looking at Rob's Podcast 101 book and going step by step by step to make sure that I set up and organized and tagged and got my sound quality straight and everything nice and organized to distribute my first few episodes of the Podcast Digest. He is an absolute authority in podcasting. So back to the show I'm recommending today in iOS. Rob is a listener engagement-centric expert. He features listener-created artwork for each episode, listener-created music at the beginning and end of each episode that somebody's done on an iOS device. He will facilitate app giveaways from smaller developers looking to get the word out about their application for iPhone or iPad. A couple of years ago, I actually did win a promo code from Rob and Today in iOS. He takes voicemails and emails from listeners. This can include feedback, tips, tricks, complaints, questions, and it's probably about 75% of the content of each week. It's a huge benefit because it's so often something that you will probably have come across if you're an iPhone or an iPad owner. If you have an iPhone, if you have an iPad, and you want to know more, or you want to just kind of know what's going on in the world of those devices, check out this show. I guarantee you, you will be very happy that you did. Rob covers so much of the iOS world, the device releases, the apps, the competition. He goes over user polls, studies, financial information, anything that's really connected to the world of Apple and iOS. Now, I just want to say, make no mistake, this is definitely an Apple fan show, right? Rob makes no bones about it. But if that does describe you, I really think this is something that should be on your subscription list. Back in episode 4, I had recommended Ken Ray's macOS Ken, and Rob actually talks about being a listener of macOS Ken, and this is really the perfect companion app. macOS Ken is a Monday through Friday show, whereas Rob is basically a weekly show that can kind of cover the highlights, running at anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, depending on what's going on in the Apple world. I also do want to give a special shout out to Rob's Today in iOS Google Plus community. It's got over 1,500 members, and it seems to be growing by what seems like 100 members a week each time I listen to a new episode. Rob puts out a ton of effort moderating and keeping the topics and discussion on topic spam-free, and it really is. Now, I'm not a huge Google Plus fan per se, but I can tell you that community is one reason I consistently launch the Google Plus app on my iPhone to check it out. And I should probably also mention this because this actually came up when I was putting together these show notes. On a previous show, I also recommended Profit Cast with The Real Brian, and Rob and his co-host, on Libsyn's official podcast, The Feed, Elsie. They did an awesome interview with Brian, who's the host of Profit Cast. So if you want to know more about what Rob does, his vast experience in podcasts, check out the recent episode of Profit Cast, and it is wildly informative. If you're a podcaster, you need to hear that episode of Profit Cast with Rob and Elsie from Libsyn. Trust me, it's worth the time. So that's my first show recommendation this week, Today in iOS. Check out Rob Walsh on Twitter at Podcast411 or their website, tii.libsyn.com. For my second show recommendation this week, I'm going to go back and give you another option similar to what I recommended 2 weeks ago on episode 7. I talked about S. Anthony and the S. Anthony Thomas Says podcast, the S. Anthony Says podcast. I'm sorry. First of all, S. Anthony is a great guy. He's all over Twitter, always talking with me about, promoting his shows, and he's been wonderfully supportive of the Podcast Digest. So I hope you have found S. Anthony and his show. If you want to know more about that one, check out episode 7. But this falls in the same genre, a comedy podcast. I've really been getting into comedy podcasts lately. It is so cool to just kind of sit back and have your ears full of just absolutely hilarious material. And it reminds me, actually, before I tell you what the show is, something I heard on a recent podcast. And to be honest, I'm forgetting which one it was. But they talked about back in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s, stand-up comedians sort of had Comedy Central or HBO specials to sort of showcase their material. If you know anything about the podcasting world today in 2014, comedians have kind of invaded podcasting, and so many great comedians have podcasts out there, and it is an awesome way to discover comedians maybe that you've not heard of or spent enough time with, or maybe just seen a quick snippet of in a movie or a brief stand-up thing. It is sort of their playground, if you will, to try out new material and get some feedback from a live listening audience, if you will. And this one is no different. My second show recommendation this week is the Dana Gould Hour. The host, of course, is Dana Gould. Can be found on Twitter at Dana Gould. That's Gould for the last name. Website is www.danagould.com. He is a very accomplished comedian, producer, and actor. If you've not heard of Dana Gould, let me tell you a little bit about him. He was a producer on The Simpsons for over 7 years. He's been a producer with Parks and Recreation, a ton of guest and character spots in movies and television, over 50 actor credits, according to IMDb. And last year, he actually released his own stand-up special called I Know It's Wrong. Dana's podcast has been around since January 2012, putting out about 1 to 2 episodes a month, right around coming in about the 2-hour mark. So see my comments earlier in this episode about show length. I don't want that to bother you. He's got maybe 4 to 6 guests and has a unique format because it's sort of Dana and 2 to 3 guests in one, the first segment of the show. And then he comes back and does it again with a second set of guests and sort of alternates back and forth in these 2 rooms, if you will, where he's talking to fellow comedians, friends, other stand-up guys. And it is absolutely hilarious. This really keeps the show super dense, super funny. It is literally kind of line after line after line, story after story after story. And you can tell these are top-of-the-line stand-up comedians, and they're all kind of working on their material. It sort of reminds me of what it would be like to sit backstage before a huge stand-up comedy sort of marathon and just hearing these guys kind of riff on each other, riff on current events, riff on stories from their past. It is awesome. I do want to say, as I've pointed out in the past with some of my other show recommendations, this is definitely an adult comedy podcast. So keep that in mind. Don't throw this on the car with the kids around. Each episode he puts out tends to be somewhat lately themed. His most recent one is a Halloween episode. The one preceding was for back to school. And the other ones that don't necessarily have a tight theme are sort of kind of a variety show feel. He has several regular guests, Eddie Pepitone, April Richardson, Matt Weinhold, and he's got some great recurring segments on there. He does this one that's one of my personal favorites. It's 2 guys from Boston, and if you know anything about the Northeastern accent, especially of Bostonians, you can imagine where these type of segments go, and that's exactly what happens. It is wonderful comedic entertainment. It's really hard to sort of summarize and categorize a podcast like this other than to say, if you enjoy comedy and you want to laugh out loud while you have your earbuds in or your podcast playing to the Bluetooth on the car, check out the Dana Gould Hour. I have a feeling you will like it. I did want to make one special note on Dana's website. As I said, danagould.com. Click on the video tab. Okay, even if you're not at the point where you want to subscribe to his podcast based on what I'm telling you, go there, check out that, and there's so much great content up there. He's got what I think is the full-length stand-up special I mentioned earlier, I Know It's Wrong, and a ton more clips and videos from his stand-up career. It's an awesome way to easily find out if you and Dana's sense of humor will get along. I know it certainly works for me. So those are my two show recommendations this week, Today in iOS and the Dana Gould Hour. Two immediate listens for me each and every week that they come out, or a couple of weeks in the case of Dana Gould Hour. But I want to talk about next week before I let you go today. Next week is episode 10, finally into double digits. I feel like I'm approaching on being like this respected podcast, right? Won't that be nice? I've had some thoughts about episode 10, maybe making like every 10 episodes some form of special edition. Maybe I might go off topic a bit. Last week I did with my brief description of my new Pebble smartwatch, sort of a technology pro tip I called it. Maybe something along those lines, or maybe thinking about doing a deep dive on some of my previous shows, maybe some highlights of some individual episodes from previous shows I've recommended. I'm really not sure, or if I'll just come back with two more show recommendations for you. If you've got strong feelings, though, I'd really like to know your thoughts. We're going to talk about how you can let me know what you think in just a minute. But also I wanted to get your feedback about some longer range topics beyond next week's show. I've been thinking about possibly getting some guests here on the Podcast Digest. Ideally, I'd love to do an interview or two. I'm thinking about maybe doing a show recommendation of a show, and if I can organize this and make this happen, bring back the host of that show to talk about, the podcast itself, or maybe bringing in some hosts from previous episodes, previous episode show recommendations, and talking with them about, how things have been going since I reviewed their show, or talk about how they got into podcasting. Or I've thought about maybe using guests and asking them to give you one of their show recommendations. So many podcast hosts are also podcast listeners, and I think that would be another great way to sort of expand the breadth of my recommendations to all you guys, to get some other great podcast listeners, bring you what they love to listen to. So there's another idea. I've had all kinds of different ideas about things that I could do with the show and broaden its scope, and I'd really love to hear from you. So if you're not following the show on Twitter yet, please do, @PodDigest. Shoot me a message. Let me know on any of these about next week's episode, about maybe bringing in some guest hosts, or what you'd like to see those guests or guest hosts do. Also, check out the website, thepodcastdigest.info. It's probably the easiest place to go back through all the back episodes. You can see a couple of different blog entries that I don't actually publicize here, things talking about the release schedule and how different episodes are doing. I've been trying to do more and more of the blog entries there. And don't forget the places you can find the Podcast Digest, guys: iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Player FM, and a review. Guys, please, it would so be appreciated on iTunes and Stitcher especially. They're the best places to leave a 5-star review for the Podcast Digest. It super helps me out. It allows other people to find the show and lets me know that there are those listeners on the other end of this microphone I'm staring at right now. That'll do it for this week. A little bit long, and for that I apologize, but we already talked about show length, didn't we? This is Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest, thanking you so much for spending these 23 minutes listening to me, and I will talk to you again next week.